Welcome to Baltic World. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
This is our second episode of our book review. So thank you so much to Pauzo for recommending Between Shades of Grey by Ruta Sepetys?
Yes.
Sepetys. Released in 2011. And it's by a Lithuanian American. So that's interesting to note. Yeah. You okay? You're looking at me weirdly.
Oh, no, I was just wondering where to jump in. Yeah, so I went out of my way not to know anything about the author, anything out of the background, no other reviews, no nothing, just launched straight into the text.
Sure.
But it was evident to me in reading the text that it was a Lithuanian American. We'll discuss that a bit later. But it's a fantastic book, and I'm really excited to be talking about it today.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting book. But before we get into it, if you have any other texts you want to recommend to be part of this series, please leave them down below. So we're focusing on Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe. Fiction, I guess.
Yeah,
Yes?
primarily. I mean, if you say, look, there is a non-fiction that we absolutely must read, and we've got a couple of recommendations. One about Lithuanian mythology that I will be picking up and reading. Whether we do an actual review on it, I'm not sure. We will definitely be continuing to do reviews on fiction from the Baltic region. So anything out of that region that you really admire. I also would like to do The Jungle, which was written about Lithuanian immigrants in the United States. Highly influential during the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. So we'll do that at a future point, but probably not next. So yeah, do leave your recommendations down below.
Yeah, for sure. And so this book has been widely acclaimed. It's been translated in 30 languages. Quite amazing. And there's a film adaptation to this too. So after this, we'll probably go watch it.
Yeah, we haven't watched it yet.
No.
People have been telling us to watch it, but I don't want us to be spoiled in terms of the book. We want to focus on the text, and then we will review the movie as a separate thing at a future time.
Yeah. So it follows the main protagonist, Lina, and it's 1939, 41-ish. 41. For when basically gets deported from Lithuania, doesn't know where she's going with her mum and her little brother, and we kind of follow her journey up into the northern parts of Siberia.
That's exactly right. So we really enjoyed doing the Witcher review in the first episode, but it was a bit over the place. So we've got much more structured this time. As she says, the NKVD at the start of the book, they burst into the house. They take Elena, Jonas, and Lina being the protagonist who's sort of writing the story from her perspective, telling the audience what happens. And it follows their journey as people who are Lithuanian, deported from Kaunas, deported all the way through Vilnius into Western Russia, right up to Northern Siberia. And the book follows that journey.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess I really like this book overall because it was it was an easy read. But it was easy to follow. I think just from the contrast on The Witcher, where it kind of like jumped to different stories, this was cohesive. Because you're kind of like, I was in anticipation of every chapter, like, where are they going next? What's going to happen next? So I found that really engaging. And not my version, but your version had questions at the back. So I guess the style of this book, talks from Lina's perspective, but the audience would probably be around her age as well.
Yeah, so this text, to my mind, and I'm confident that the author herself would be saying this, that the target audience is clearly high school students, people in the classroom. It's very likely that people in the Baltic countries recommend this text to their students, perhaps in the English classes, perhaps in their history classes. They read and then review the text. It is written clearly for that collaborative effort. So you read the book, but then you're supposed to discuss what's in the book with others, and the discussion questions that were in my Kindle version kind of go into that. But this format is a very common trope, the coming of age kind of sequence where you've got a teenager going through a lot of teenage things. The main question for a teenager is, who am I and what do I believe? So there is a whole series of contrasts through the book where she's reviewing what's going on in her diary from the pre-deportation period, what she was thinking about, what her day-to-day struggles were, and then it jumps into the traumas and horrors of the current experience. And this is a very common way of writing for young adult fiction, where there's an epic, the person is not where they started. They physically usually get up and go someplace.
Yeah.
They go through a series of trials, and those trials help to shape them as a person and also reveal who they really are. And so that is a very common way of writing towards that target audience, where the actual audience themselves are struggling with those questions. Who am I? What do I believe? Where do I want to end up? And so it is a common way of writing, but this case is exceptional in its quality. I can't recommend this book enough. And it's rare. Like, I'm a very critical critic, and there's a lot of things that upset me about various books, including this one. But it's rare that I can say unequivocally, you should really read this book. And I think that this book would be much of great benefit to a very wide audience, including here in Australia and other parts of the Western world. I wouldn't just want to see this book in libraries in the Baltic. I want high schools around the world to be reading this book, because it does write in a very common teaching format. Most English classes around the world will draw on these types of texts to teach their English classes. This is probably the best of that genre.
Yeah, and I do agree that the format is very digestible because of just the contrast. You get to see Lina's life before she was deported and her reality now. And I think, as a young person, you're thinking like, wow, yeah, you have all these hopes and dreams. Like, Lina wants to become an artist, and she was like, oh, you can go to this place. And her teacher sees potential in her. But then contrast, the stark reality is like she can't go there, actually. She is put in this wagon, what are they called? Like, a cart with other people that she has no idea who they are, and they're like, it's stinky, she hasn't eaten for days, she wants fresh water, like, it's just survival mode for, I guess, the modern young person. But like, how does somebody experience that, but going to Lina's character, I think she was a very strong protagonist. She really, you could see that she really cared for her family, and like throughout the book she more and more realized what was important in her life, which was her family and caring for others, and kind of trying to understand her mum's motivations. I don't know, what do you think about Lina?
I thought she was a very good narrator, but a somewhat untrustworthy narrator. And I like this. This is actually a quality of the book. When you are reading something from a person's perspective, and you can't necessarily 100% rely on everything that she says. So, for example, Elena comes across as a truly angelic being, right? Everything about, she's always patient. She's always loving towards others. She always thinks about every other person first. She has an outburst once in the whole book when her children suspect that she's cavorting with the NKVD inappropriately. She's not, of course. And she reacts to that, but that's an understandable reaction because she's having her honor slighted. And so she comes across as perfect. And that, from the perspective of a daughter, makes sense. Like, it's acceptable when you read it from the perspective of the protagonist. If it was a third party writing about her in that way, then you would be more suspicious. And there are parts of the book where other people, other characters in the book reveal things to Lina that Elena does not reveal. So in that sense, that kind of perspective view where you have to actually think about and criticize at points where the protagonist is coming from is a very advanced form of writing, because it's not written from the perspective of the author, it's written from the perspective of the character. Lina also strikes me as a typical teenager in some ways. She's looking at this from a perspective of what's fair from a view of a teenager. So she is in a hopeless situation. What's happening to her is absolutely abusive. There is no justice in what's occurring at all. But she's not looking at it from a perspective of the broader context. She's looking at it from what's fair for her. Like, why is it that these things are happening to her? She has no explanation for why it's happening to her. And that confusion really comes through. And there's no rules that she can abide by where things don't happen. And she does have a rebelliousness to her. So she gets angry towards the NKVD in a way that other people don't. They kind of just accept that this is happening. They don't have any control. They try and get by as what they can, whereas she's always at risk at getting into serious trouble because she's constantly doing things in these kind of minor acts of rebellion. Now, this rebellion is viewed as heroic in the context of the story, as teenage rebellion can be. Most of the time when teenagers rebel, people go, oh, they're teenagers, they're playing up, their hormones are taking over, whatever. And often teenage rebellion is more angst than legitimate. But one of the rebellions that teenagers have, it does remind society that these rebellions are sometimes necessary. So I actually think that she was a believable protagonist. She wasn't perfect. She was quick to judge other people. So if someone did something, she always assumed the worst about them. I really liked that. I thought that showed a frailty towards the character that meant that she wasn't omnipotent. She wasn't looking at things from the broadest possible view. Elena would always assume the best in people, her mother, whereas Lina would always assume the worst. And I thought that was a good contrast.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt really sad for Lina at some points, just because, she was really trying to, I guess it is come from rebellion, trying to express herself properly. And the only way she could do it was through her drawings privately, right? And then even then, she was criticized, why do you have such drawings? You should tear them up. And, even when she had to do that portrait of one of the NKVD officers, she badly wanted to ruin the portrait to really express what she really thinks. And I think many people are put in that situation. I think a lot of young people are like, why can't the world be this way? Why do I have to abide by these kind of rules? And I guess the point about how, from her perspective, there's a bit of bias because Elena is the mother. But the thing is, I guess so. It's human nature, right? I don't look at my mum she has everything put together. I know nothing. My mum is the best person ever. Don't we all feel that way? But yeah, okay. Well, what about Jonas then? So Jonas was the younger brother of Lina.
Yes.
And for me personally, besides there was a plot about Jonas getting scurvy and everyone uniting in order to heal Jonas, I didn't really connect with him as much as I did the other characters. He was just there. He leaned on to Andrius a lot because of lack of a father figure. But apart from that, I didn't get much.
Yeah, Jonas, he was there. He didn't seem like a main character, even though he kept popping up in the story, because he didn't have, as you say, his own plot lines very much. And there was a kind of degree of waiting for his story to come out, because he'd be off doing things and you would hear about them. He was telling people he made shoes and got all these potatoes and things. So he was very good at scrounging supplies and getting things that helped the rest of the family, the rest of the prisoners. And so someone who was reading the book would think that, okay, there's something going on behind the scenes here
he was,
where we will get that reveal later in the book. But that never happens. So Jonas as a younger character, as a main character, it wasn't as impactful. So I do relate to you on that level. He seemed like a perfectly, nice boy and kind of a likable relief, if you like. Gave, I think, Elena a stronger reason to survive and to protect her children. And Jonas was a positive character. He was the one that was always kind of hopeful for the future. The burdens of what was happening around them didn't seem to affect him as much. And so he was a kind of hope and inspiration for others just by being kind of generally optimistic.
Yeah, but I thought Elena would be that more than Jonas, because Elena felt like, oh no, well, we're going to send a letter off to your father, and had all these things and then talking to the officers. Like, she was trying, like, everything.
Yeah, she was very resourceful, and of course she could speak fluent Russian, and she was of use to everyone around her. But I think Jonas, like Elena, had the filter of she could experience the world as it was, and she would make it easier on her children. So, for a good example, they're sent out to a collective farm where they have to create beets or something, and Lina is getting like blistered hands from the digging with these shovels that have no handles, and the ground is hard because of the cold. And Elena's saying, "Look, you just pretend to do it, and I'll do it, and that will be fine." Like, Elena does all these things all throughout the story to make it easier on others. And even when there are individuals who are complaining, who objectively speaking don't have it as bad as Elena herself, Elena still puts them first, or at least tries to.
Yeah.
Whereas Jonas is a child and experiences the world as a child. And so he doesn't have the kind of the multi-layered filter of trying to protect others from experiencing the realities of the thing, but he does just have a child's resilience. So he is experiencing what's going on, kind of accepting it and putting a positive spin on things. So Jonas does strike me as a kind of hopeful character. The other thing with scurvy, the choice of scurvy is very interesting. Now, no spoilers here. He gets scurvy. They try and help him. We won't reveal what happens. But scurvy is a disease that was largely eradicated around the age of Napoleon, just after, where Sir Joseph Banks, a scientist botanist on the Endeavour with Captain Cook, he discovered the cure, which was basically fresh fruit. Right. So what was happening was that if you were at sea for years at a time, you would get this disease called scurvy, and it was horrible the way it would eat away at you. And yet the cure was straightforward. Eat
oranges, vitamin C, rich foods.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's a totally preventable, easily curable illness.
Yeah.
And the fact that in the 1940s you had children suffering from scurvy and no one really wanting to treat it, shows the depth of the conditions that they were in, and the fact that they tried to treat it with fairly obvious means kind of shows that he was a good example of the depravities of what was happening to them as well. So on the one hand, he was a hopeful character. On the other hand, he was a good vehicle for helping the reader understand the level of the conditions that they were in.
Okay, sure. Okay. Strong supportive character, let's put that.
Yeah.
Perhaps. All right, so I think very briefly touched on Elena. Was there anything else you want to add on Lena?
On Lena, the protagonist?
No, Elena. Elena.
No, I mean, she's a highly educated woman. You can tell that this was a semi sort of affluent family in Kaunas. The father, Kostas, was at the university there. And so that was an obvious reason why they were rounded up. They were part of the bourgeoisie intelligentsia of Lithuania. And the magnitude of the difference in their living standards is extreme. So they were kind of upper middle class in Kaunas, but they're put on the most inhospitable forms of transport, crammed in with other people, people dying rapidly as they are experiencing tremendous hardships, and they've gone from being respected members of the community to essentially slaves. In fact, their truck that they're on is labelled prostitutes and thieves, so they're just labelled criminals and sent off to the middle of nowhere. Now, this all happens in the opening days of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. So Germany invades the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa in 1941. A couple of days later, the NKVD rounds up all these people and deports them off to Russia. So that's the prompting incident. They round these people up who they think are going to go over to the Germans. And they preempt that by grabbing them first and sending them off to Siberia. That's the kind of the circumstance. So there is a certain rushed aspect to it in the early part of the book. This is something else I'd actually talk about in terms of the structure.
I really like the first chapter because you just go straight into it. Like, there's no fluff. There's no like, oh, this is our life and blah, blah, blah. It's like I heard a knock on the door.
Exactly, straight away. And the book is divided into 3 clear acts, okay? There's Act 1, which is the initial transportation, the capturing, rounding up, meeting all the new characters, all of them being pushed in the same situation, in this extreme situation of fear, of uncertainty, and being shipped off into the Soviet Union. That's Act 1. And that journey, which takes place over a period of weeks and months. Then Act 2 is when they're in the collective farm together in kind of the middle of Russia, where they're growing beets and potatoes and things like that for the Soviet Union, for the war effort. That is kind of like a halfway house for their... That's when people, like by that stage, people are dying. There's all these kinds of hardships. Their NKVD guards are perpetrating all kinds of abuses. And the insanity nature of the Soviet system starts to reveal itself. Then Act 3 is when they get shipped off again to northern Siberia. So the division of the story and the progression of the story is really interesting. And obviously Elena and Lina both follow that entire arc.
The impact that Elena had on the other characters was quite profound. So not only did she influence her children to, take care of others, but like the other people, strangers, she helped out at the time. She would like give them potatoes or extra beets in underwear, and for survival. And even getting to talk to the NKVD, how do you say it? Kretzsky?
Kretzsky. I'm going to say Kretzsky. Nikolai Kretzsky. Kretzsky. Yeah, Kretzsky. I think that's what I'm
Yeah, and even gets to influence him, and he shows some kindness throughout the book, which you don't expect at all. So I found that to be quite interesting. I liked Elena as a character. And the next character is Kostas. So Kostas is the husband to Elena, and the father of Lina and Jonas. He's not the main character of the story, but he's talked about a lot. The children are like, when can we see dad again? Our father, like, how's he doing? Trying to find out ways to get in contact with him. And there are parts in the book where it seems like it's possible. And no spoilers for what happens there. He does show up early-ish in the book. That's not spoilery. And then there is interesting stories about what happens with him later on, which we won't get into. But he does show up a lot in Lina's diary. So what happens is you're reading the experiences of Lina, Jonas, and Elena and all the other main characters as it's happening, but then Lina has all these flashbacks in her diary, and so Kostas is an omnipresent character throughout the book because he keeps showing up in the diary, and you get a sense of who he is and what he was trying to do from the other characters. It's kind of alluded to in the book. Yeah, and I think Lena's, like, from her diary, it seems that Lina really wanted to connect with her dad on the political situation. Like, she really wanted to understand, but I think her father was trying to protect her in a lot of it, being like, it's not your place, you shouldn't do this, don't worry about it. Yes, I mean, and you can understand, so there is this period of time in history where Lithuania had been occupied by the Soviet Union prior to the German invasion. So the Soviets essentially annexed Lithuania in 1940, and you have this sort of resistance, passive resistance, quiet resistance, shadow group, if you like, who are pushing back against the Soviets or trying to help others escape the Soviet Union. And the danger of having one of your children say something because they've overheard something or they believe something or something their parents have told them would be too extreme. If you're a parent who's operating in that space, you have to be afraid even of your own children. And so you need to
protect your children, make sure they don't say something that's going to get them into trouble, but also nothing that would get you into trouble because they've got a belief from you. So Kostas is constantly in the diary encouraging the children to say positive things about the Soviet Union, positive things about Stalin, trying to get along with the communist overlords so as that they're protected, but also it doesn't put suspicion on the activities of what they're actually up to.
Yeah, and it makes sense if he's from the mid upper class. He's actually surrounded by these people that have the power to do such things, right? So the stakes are way higher. But do you think he was a good dad?
I think so. I think the one interaction we get early on in the book is one of great sacrifice, clear-sighted pragmatism. I think is actually really, he puts the interests of his wife and children ahead of sentimentality even. And so he's very clear-minded about that. And clearly, he's raising very good people. So that's going to reflect well on him. I think that the children certainly think of him warmly. Elena thinks of him very warmly. So, he strikes me as just a good figure. But like most fathers, particularly in that era, he's always a distant figure. And that, I think, is true of most young adult fiction books. You do get some where he's a widower and it's just the child and the dad. And one of the things you have to do is help bridge that masculine divide, that fatherly role. And one of the challenges the child has is to do that. That never comes up in this book because they're primarily with their mother, and he is a perennial part of the story in the background. And so he has an influence on their behavior, and the memories and attitudes of him are influential. So I think it's actually quite analogous to a normal nuclear household where the father is the breadwinner off working, off on business trips and things like that, and sort of sitting there in the background in the sense that the children do think about what he would be thinking. So that's a good analogous example of real life in the sense that, yes, not everybody's got to be in prison and sent to Siberia, but many people can relate to having a distant father. And in this case, he doesn't seem emotionally distant. He seems just physically distant.
And I think, but then also I think it helped to have it wasn't all women and children. Like they did have other men around in their group.
I think that was a compromise by the author actually. So there is a part early on where they're dividing the men and the women and children, right? And they're separating them. And we won't spoil it, but Jonas, the young boy, stays with Elena. And there's this other character, which we're yet to discuss, Andrius, who manages to stay with his mother, Mrs. Arvydas. And particularly in the case of Andrius, because he's like 17, it's very unusual that he's the only prisoner of that age group who was with the women and children, but because they needed more male characters, I think, the author has found a way to, within the context of the story, because it all happens through bribery and corruption and so forth, within the context of the story, introduce these characters as main characters and keep them with Lina throughout the story, because otherwise you would just have women and children. And also the bald man.
Bald man.
He was like Mr. Stalas. Stalas, I think his name is. Or have I got it wrong?
I remember Stalas. Yeah, I think it's one of those.
Stalas. I'll just call him Stalas. If it's wrong, you'll know who I'm talking about. So one of the interesting things, I didn't touch on this before, is Lina writes about other characters, sometimes using their name, but most of the time, if it's people that she doesn't particularly personally like, by a descriptor. So Stalas is used, he's called the bald man. There's another character later in the book, which we probably won't discuss, who's like the repeater, right? Who always says something and then repeats the word that he just said. So Lina is describing these people as if they're NPCs. And I I think that's a good writing technique. I think it actually personalizes it for Lina. Whereas, of course, this is not something that any of the other characters ever do. Lina does not call him the bald man. She calls him Mr. Stalas. And she's always very formal with other people as well, Elena, which I think is very touching. I think we've lost that formality in the modern day.
She's so formal that she had spare clothes. Always ready to go.
Yes, that's right. So right to the worst conditions, Charlene's just mentioning that Elena keeps a spare set of clothes for when she sees somebody else. We won't go into it. In case she sees, like, she's in that social situation. She doesn't want to be unprepared. So even though she's enduring this tremendous hardship and there were other uses for those clothes that would be more productive in the here and now, Elena doesn't do that because she wants to maintain her sense of decorum. And it's an interesting facet of that character because she does throughout the story make decisions that are in the best interest of her dignity rather than her survival. And that's an interesting, interesting sacrifice trade-off to make.
Yeah. All right, moving down to Andreas. So this character, Andreas, I liked his character, just didn't understand we kind of explained the role of Andreas, that you need more male representation on a practical sense. But aside from smuggling things, kind of like Jonas, all the food to help the others, and being a love interest, don't know where else he sits in the book.
Yeah, so for those that aren't familiar, Elena, Jonas, and Lina, they get taken by the NKVD and they're shoved into the back of a van, essentially, or a cabin of some sort, with these other people. So they don't know each other at all. The bald man, Andreas, a number of other characters, Mrs. Arvydas, they are all there. They're all in the same kind of boat and they're being shipped off to God knows where. So that's how they're all come together and to know each other. They don't know each other prior to that, and they're all kind of learning the survival together, and they're all reacting to it in different ways. The bald man is constantly complaining, which we will talk about later, and Andreas is kind of just this weathered teenager who has already been through some hardships by the time they get to him. So he starts out, his father was a military officer. And there is a strong implication that his father had already been executed, that there was a purge of anyone that was of sort of fighting capability. And because he was a bourgeoisie military officer, there is a belief that Stalin had already had him executed.
Does he go look for his father? He
does. He is determined to find his father, but there is an inference, and I won't give it away because it's not clear at this stage. There is an inference when they first meet that the father has been executed, right? And Andreas is just like, it's like his mother is protecting him from that truth, and he's determined to find him. So he's constantly making taking risks to do that. He's the strongest male character of the prisoners. Because he is supposed to have been shipped off with the other men, but because of this bribery and corruption, he's allowed to be with the women and children. And his role, from my perspective, is to provide a surrogate father figure for Jonas, because Jonas is a small child, but more importantly for Lina to have a love interest, because Lina is of that age. She's a teenage girl. She needs a boy. This is a novel. And so Andreas provides that opportunity as a handsome young Lithuanian teenager.
Yeah, definitely. Such a great father figure that he is, where he smokes Lina's book, like, so in the cab, in the wagon, or what is it? And they smoke his Lina got a gift from his grandmother, and they smoke her book, which I just found quite funny.
Yeah. Now, one of the criticisms I have, and we're nowhere near the criticisms of the book, but one of the criticisms I have, this is a nitpick. It's a nitpick, is that everyone is so shocked that Andreas is smoking. Right? This is 1941. everyone thought smoking was healthy, right?
Yeah.
The idea that if you're in northeastern Europe, people around would be like, oh, smoking, and I mean, I can understand if you're writing this book in 2011, which is when it was published, and you're teaching kids in schools today that yes, smoking is inappropriate, particularly for young people. But back in the day, smoking was nothing, right? It was just a normal thing, and if you could get a cigarette, great. And so the kind of scandalous nature of the people around them being like, oh, what a terrible influence he might be on Jonas and stuff. No, that's silly. Nobody would have thought that. Everyone would have just thought, oh, yeah, it's great. Because, yeah, no ill effects of any kind from their point of view. And put it this way.
For them, it's kind of like relief, right? It's like their quote-unquote treat back then because they had nothing else, right? So...
And people would have loved the fact that it was an appetite suppressant. And, yeah, I mean... It
has practicality, like survival mode, like if you can...
Well, yeah. But like, what are you thinking is going to happen? This is many decades before any link with lung cancer or anything had even been suggested, let alone established. And so you're in World War II and you're being deported to Siberia, and your concern is that Jonas might take up smoking. That was a bit jarring for me. And I think that, I mean, it's a nitpick. It's not a big deal. But I do think that if you are going to talk about that period, there are things that they could have, like if they were worried about the influence that Andrius was having, and I have to say, Elena doesn't have that fear. So Elena, there's a line in the book where Lina is complaining to Elena about Andrius for some reason, and Elena says, I thank God every day that Jonas has Andrius.
Yeah.
And so she doesn't mind at all the influence that Andrius has. Andrius is looking out for Jonas, and she loves that fact. I think that's great. Probably true to what a mother in that situation would be thinking. But if you wanted to have, a scandal in there, if you wanted to have the Andrius having a bad habit that he might be imparting onto young people, have him drinking or something. Have him like find some terrible fermented fruit somewhere, get drunk, and then get Jonas drunk as well. Like that might be a little bit more persuasive, but cigarettes at the time were not thought of as being... I'm old enough to have had candy that was shaped like a cigarette and called a derivative name of a cigarette. And my mum used to give them to me to eat because they were delicious. And they've been renamed now and they look slightly different. They're not as interesting anymore. But yeah, these are, I mean, and even when I was a kid. Anyway.
Yeah. Moving on. Mind because moving on. I'm a young person. I'm like, yeah, ciga's bad. Oh, yeah, right up. Yeah, totally agree. Don't even think too. But it makes sense though because you have dying children and in the cart all the time. And that's actually one thing I did like the book. Not about the dying children, but yeah. She
loved all those dying kids.
All those dying kids in the book.
Gets you up in the morning, helps you with the cereal.
Next character.
Well, we probably haven't finished with Andrius yet. So Andrius, he is quite important because he deals with everybody in the story. So they get to the collective farm, and he's dealing with the NKVD. He's dealing with the prisoners, and there's all this suspicion around him early on because he does show up with stuff that there's not really good explanation for how or why he comes across it. They do end up providing an interesting explanation and reveal. I think that reveal is quite important for Lina's character. It's quite important for Andrius and the relationship that exists between them. It creates a real drama and tension between those two. And the different ways in which they are trying to survive this situation, and to show that there's not just one way to do that honorably. The thing about Andrius that I did like was Elena is very proud, and she doesn't want to do anything that debases her dignity. So she's portrayed as a real hero from a kind of Lithuanian national point of view, that you never give in, you don't give them, what's the line? Don't give them anything, not even your fear, right? And so the Lina is also very kind of rebellious and resistant to anything. And Andreas is a bit more pragmatic, and he is dealing with things that are eating him alive, right? The stresses that he is put under to protect others and to know that he himself is protected is extreme. And so that's why it's called Between Shades of Grey. Andreas, I think, is a character that is among the most grey of all the characters. So we'll call him the bald man. I think it's Mr. Stalas, but I can't remember exactly. So we'll call him the bald man because that's what Lina calls him.
Yeah. I guess the bald man for me was kind of a comic relief, because every time I read, he's like, I just want to die. They got to kill us. We might as well kill ourselves before we suffer. And like, just sign the papers. Like, is that what you got from it? I don't know. He was my favorite character by far. Not because he was constantly complaining, everything that did get tiresome, but it was more that he's clearly the most pragmatic. Okay, so what happens is he's thrown in the back of this vehicle with the rest of the women and children because he's got a broken leg. Okay, and so he's useless to work with the men, so they chuck him with the women and children. And then presumably his leg heals during the course of the story, and so he's then able to participate in the other things that the women and children are doing, such as farming and so forth. Now, he is portrayed as this complaining, selfish, self-righteous, arrogant kind of character. And he is all of those things, but he's also kind of got a gruff nobility about him. He constantly, very quietly puts other people first when it's required, and is kind of fair and pragmatic when he's relied upon for things. So if he's asked to do something, he generally does it. And including when he could get a benefit out of not doing those things. But he is also someone who looks at the situation as hopeless, right? That he sees everyone else is kidding themselves, that this story is not going to have a happy ending, that people are holding on to things that are just deceiving them from their own intellectual aspersions and so forth. And he's also quite mean when it goes too far. So, for example, there's this woman who loses her baby. Oh my god!
And he's like, "What did you think was going to happen? This is the best thing for the baby." Like it's very harsh, right?
Like, throw it out, stinks. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, he's very much. Now, but here's the thing: he's not wrong, right? And while it doesn't help the kind of human spirit, and wouldn't be conducive to their collective survival if his view was the view of everybody else, it was necessary to have the heroic characters. But he's also there doing something that is important for the reader, at least, that he's reminding people of the reality of the situation. And so while he's complaining and whatnot, it's not that he's an unlikable character. He's actually providing context. He's people, because what happens is these characters, they get together and they express hope and optimism and what they're going to try and do and all their plans and working together to survive and so forth. And this is all great. But then you've just got to have this character who's like, no, the NKVD are shipping us out in the middle of nowhere and they're going to kill us, right? Like he's very clear about this stuff. And his suggestions on the journey are also very pragmatic. So, for example, he's in the car or whatever. I'm just going to call it a cart, right? And he's with all the people. And then Lina is able to get up and see outside through a crack where they are. And he's like, don't just like stand there, girl. Tell us what you see. Like, you know, are there any stations? Are there any signs? Who else is that? Like, he's actually he's the one collecting all the data to help perhaps come up with a plan. So although he's not the guy who's, valiantly leading people in their resistance effort, he's the one actually thinking things through. If you were going to survive, these are the things that you would do. And so he's actually the one that really gets people doing the right thing, even though he's the one constantly complaining and talking about they're all going to die and everything. So ironically, he is among the most useful of all the characters, because if it wasn't for his prompting and bullying and direction, they wouldn't be doing things that were useful. They'd just be corralling together and waiting to die. So he's actually extremely useful in that respect.
Wouldn't you want to die ignorantly, though? With some hope.
Well, he is cynical. I mean, that's the drawback. Like, you couldn't have all the characters like that because it would be a very short book. But,
it would be.
But it is also, you need one character like that. You need one character to be like, okay, this is what you want, this is what you have to do. I'm
surprised. So he must be around the NKVD. He must have not talked a lot, right? Because, I would have felt threatened had he said all those things.
Yeah.
Like, he wouldn't, he has a big mouth, so he would have, like...
Yeah, it is surprising that the NKVD didn't off him, but maybe they enjoyed him. Maybe they thought that he was a good influence on the rest of them. Now it is there is something about this character that is revealed later on.
Oh.
There's a couple of things about the character that's revealed later on, and they're quite good. I actually like the reveals. It surprised the other characters, and I wasn't that surprised, but it was. They were actually positive things. I think they were positive. They're not necessarily positive or negative in the context of him as a person, but positive in terms of the narrative of the story and what it meant for the other characters. And yeah, he made a very useful contribution, I thought, to the novel as a whole. I'm very glad that the author had thought of this character and put him in there, because it would have been greatly diminished without him. A very, very strong character.
Kretzsky. So
yes.
He was one of the young NKVD officers introduced in the book. And I found him intriguing because there was a scene where I don't know how to spoil this. I don't know. It probably
no, it's not big. Are you talking about the can incident?
The can.
Where he throws a can at Lina. Oh no, okay.
No, I told about the one where they somehow they let them have a bath on their way out.
Oh yeah.
And then he turns around. You know what I mean? Like he gives them
yeah. So exactly. So they're all the women are stripped down to have a bath. They don't care because they're about to have a bath and they haven't.
They're like, yes, a bath. But he for some reason turns around, which I was like, oh, okay, interesting. And I guess we had to learn more. From Lena's perspective, he was like, this guy, you can't trust him. He has some ulterior motive. He's getting close with my mother, and I don't want my mother hurt. I don't know. I feel like Kretzsky, as you learn more about him, he kind of has morality issues of who he should be and what his role is to play throughout the book. Because he's trying to be kind, but knows he has his limits to be kind.
Yeah, so Kretzsky is one of the guards that's with the main characters throughout most of the book, because you've got the relationship between the prisoners, but you also have the relationship between the prisoners and the people watching over the prisoners. And Kretzsky is the most complicated of that relationship. He's a young man, and he is a guard who quite evidently is not naturally cruel. Okay, so when people aren't watching him, when he's not with his NKVD buddies, he is generally naturally normal, right? So as Charlene points out, the women are having a bath. Instead of ogling them or filling them up or anything, he just turns around and lets them have their privacy. When he's walking with them as individuals, when he's told to march them off to the commander's cabin or whatever, he's just quiet and marching normally until some other NKVD sees him, and then he does something publicly vicious and cruel. And so it's clear that he's heavily influenced by his social context, where he will do. There's an incident where he hurls a tin jar at Lina's head and gives her a scar because he's drunk with his NKVD friends. And so he's not naturally cruel, but he is made cruel by his role and by his environment. And that internal battle between his personal morality of just being a thoughtful human being, but also being part of a machinery that is itself savage. And one of the things that I find really important about this book, I saw an interview the other day with a historian of the gulags and the transportation system. And the first thing, because he's talking about the NKVD, and the first thing the one of the interviewers asked is, who's the NKVD? What's the NKVD? And I was like, I often complain about the education system here in Australia. This is a British interviewer. And I was like, I couldn't believe what I was hearing, because it wasn't like, oh, could you just explain for the people that don't know who the NKVD is? Because that's an understandable thing to do if you're on camera and you're like, there are people out there. He genuinely was like, who's the NKVD? Like, and the answer he got was a bit glib. It was like, oh, it's the secret police. But no, it's a very important organization in the history of the Soviet Union. So the NKVD, for those that don't know, were basically internal security services. They started off with a very minor role, but over a series of leaders that were increasingly depraved, Stalin managed to use this institution, expand its remit to get involved in every single aspect of Soviet life. Basically, every institution had NKVD influence, everything from the military to education to hospital system and so on. And the NKVD would evolve to become the KGB, which today in Russia is now the FSB. The NKVD had a culture of paranoia, right? There were purges. The NKVD were responsible for most of these purges, so they would purge. They were all of Stalin's, military. Thousands and thousands of personnel were executed by the NKVD. But then the NKVD itself would be purged. Most of the leaders of the NKVD met very ill ends, usually by their successors, and so it was a terribly evil institution, organization, probably the darkest in the world, and so the NKVD's role in deportating these people to the gulags, which they absolutely did, is quite important. So to have a young man who's like a young NKVD officer caught up in this machinery, it was a more intimate story than that. You don't go into the NKVD in terms of its massive apparatus and how it all works, because it was a bit Byzantine. Understandable for a book like this, it's not appropriate. But to have a young man who's just naturally good, but made somewhat evil and dark by this particular organization, is a really great example, I think, of the way in which everybody suffered under the Soviet system. It wasn't just the goodies and the baddies. Like, you could be a good person, but become compromised by needing to survive in this kind of reality. And I thought Kretzsky embodied that really well. But you don't really see the relationship between Kretzsky and others, like Elena, until later on, because Lina is the protagonist and you're seeing it from her perspective. So
yeah, and they probably communicated a lot more than we know of. So I guess what you're saying is, like, Kretzsky kind of represents perhaps a substantial amount of people part of the NKVD that perhaps were put in these kind of situations, but...
Well, ultimately...
I don't know.
Okay.
If like your environment influences the way you are, or like you're inherently a bad person.
Well, of course, it's both. There are people that join the NKVD because it gives them an opportunity to exploit others, and there are extraordinary cases of that. Some of the darkest people in human history were members of the NKVD because it gave them all the power and only limited oversight and culpability. Then there are people that joined the NKVD because they thought it was the right thing to do. They thought it was a good institution and only subsequently learned what it really meant. And then there were those that were kind of just joined it because it was the best career opportunity available. There were people come to these sorts of things from all walks of life, and whether you're in the NKVD or some other part of the Soviet Union, they all had their vicissitudes. In the case of Kretzsky, I ultimately didn't like the character. I liked the character right up until the very end. And one of my criticisms of the book is that you understand the motivation for his complexity, right? So he's clearly in conflict throughout the whole book, right? Between doing the right thing and doing what the NKVD would expect, right? And that conflict causes him problems in various ways. And at the very end, you understand the motivation behind this conflict. And I didn't like the motivation. I won't go into what it is, but what I would have much preferred is if he was just a native, normal, everyday Russian who had been caught up in the NKVD and was a good person. Like that kind of straightforward.
Yeah.
But they went into deep complexity about all kinds of other aspects, which actually took away from the character and took away from the human aspect of it, I thought. Because what this book does, one of my criticisms of the book, and I don't think it's intentional at all, but I think it is a implication, is that it does teach people to hate Russians. Okay.
Oh yeah, I was like, that's two sides, kind of.
Yeah, there is the book as a whole. If you're a reader, it's hard to separate the NKVD from the Russian, right? Russians generally in this book are portrayed very negatively. And I want to point out that one of the biggest victims of the NKVD, in fact, the biggest victim of the NKVD, were Russian people, okay? And if you think about how many people the NKVD executed, the vast majority were Russian, right? So I would have liked him to have been like a Russian from Moscow or whatever, who had joined the NKVD, all starry-eyed about the Soviet Union and the communist ideal, and then learn the reality as he went along, and thought, and were just helping these people because they were human beings, right? I would have thought that would be a great story. And in fact, I would have taken it one step further.
It would have made more sense of why he did the last thing.
Yeah, well, what he actually did at the end was done. I don't want to give it away, but it's clear that he hates Russia, right? And I didn't like that. I would have liked him to have just been a loyal Russian whose conscience got the better of him. Like, I think that would have been who wasn't he was an emperor who has no clothes kind of person. Be like the contradiction of the Soviet system and the communist ideal with what he was physically seeing and experiencing became too stark, and it broke him. That would have been a noble thing, and I would have would brought a bit of balance to the book. But as I said, as reading the book, you do get the feeling that Russian equals evil, and I don't think that is the author's intention when I read the book. But I do think that is the practical effect, and I was really digging Kretzsky like all through the book because I could see the conflict, I could see the problem he was experiencing, I could understand what it was like for a young man. So for the author, Ruta Sepetys is obviously a woman. She writes these young men very well, and I could see the struggle that a man like that would go through, the expectation of his superiors, of his elders, of his peers, versus his, the perception that his humanity was a weakness and a liability, and was an embarrassment and a shame that he had to suppress. I saw all of that, but in the end, they kind of ruined it, and it was an unnecessary explanation. I was much more comfortable with what my intuition was telling me. But there's a minor, it is a minor complaint because ultimately the story is about his conflict.
Yeah. Okay. The key things I liked about the book was it educated me. Full stop. So I honestly, coming from the other side of the world, had no idea, and I think maybe there's a failed education system Who knows? About the I can't say that. NKVD.
Oh, if you can't say the
I
NKVD,
can't.
wait till you try and pronounce what it stands for. You keep talking.
Okay.
I will bring it up.
Okay, sure. Because I can't put in my mind of like the atrocities that actually happened, and there are certain scenes in the book that I read it again, and I was like, how is this happening? When as we follow Lina throughout her journey, from Kaunas to Russia, or Siberia, yeah, and they're just throwing bodies out, and they're just like, there's another body out, and then another body out. It was just so stark in my mind. Like, imagine that, like going from your comfortable home to seeing like life and death right in front of you. So I found that incredibly compelling and made me want to turn the pages every time. I also really liked the relationship between the characters because they all came from different walks of life. So as the story goes on, you kind of unpeel each layer of how they kind of learn about each character and how they celebrate her birthday at one stage, thinking that everyone forgot and that was okay.
Mm-hmm.
But they're like, we're going to celebrate his birthday and that we stole this thing, but and it felt like a feast to them, and it kind of really made me feel, I guess it was heartwarming, even in the midst of suffering, they were still able to find hope and light, and joy from what they had. And it definitely made me appreciate, my family a lot more of like, yeah, it's not so much the circumstance. I guess circumstances do help things a lot, but even in the most toughest circumstances, like you can still find joy. So that was really great. And I did like the pace of the book as well. So like a lot of novels, tend to drag and they tend to invest. Like I really liked the relationship, even though they did have to have a love story, they didn't invest in it too much. So they kind of, the pace of the book was really good because you had the 3 distinct sections and you're able to tap into every single character. I didn't focus on like one or two, it focused on several. And the fact that it just opened up so just with a hit of the bang, because I remember when I first started the book, Chris was like, oh, it's getting really hectic already in like the first 5 pages, which I do appreciate, because it really puts in the context of that time. It was sudden. You had no time to even think about what was going to really happen. So and if you're a young teenager, you're like just changes all around you. So I really like that. And I guess epilogue as well. So the last part of the book explains how the book was written and how the author, went to Lithuania and spoke to a lot of people to get stories and be able to, string those stories together, add a bit of creative twist to it. It was really thoughtful, and I think it's really special to put in that way. And I like it that it's fiction because I think, it's such a sensitive, traumatic part of history, but important part that should be shared. Yeah, I don't know. I like that it was a fiction novel because I guess you're able to relate it, and then there's no, I don't know how to explain it. When you talk about like history, like it's so easy to quickly blame certain people, and then like if you make it fiction, at least everybody is like, it's the character, it's the way that person is, and and then there's not everyone is that person. So yeah, I don't know how to explain that, but
I think your positives are very well said. I think the hope in the face of extraordinary adverse circumstances done in a believable way. With the contrast of various spectrum of human responses to extreme situations. I think that's true. And I also agree with you on the pacing. I don't just mean that it's a fast-paced book, because it does jump into the action straight away. It's more than that. The actual amount of time spent on each part of the book, I think, is the right amount of time to spend on each part of the book. So it's very well structured. And one of the things that I would praise is the overall structure. So as I said, she's used a format and a trope that is very common. The young person on an epic, told from the protagonist's perspective, who happens to be a teenager, coming of age story, useful for young adult fiction. All of that is very common. There's a reason it's common. It works. But this case, it's done very, very well. And I would be extremely pleased if this book was used in most high schools, because this type of text is used all over the world for various English classes, and this book, to my mind, is clearly written for a classroom environment where it's set as part of the curriculum. Now, I would expect that it is a mandatory text already in the Baltic countries, because they do talk about Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania a lot, Poland, and therefore for the audience of this channel would be familiar with it, many people. But I think that this book is of the quality where it should be read in other parts of the world as well, as part of their education system. So not necessarily the content being as relevant for people in Australia or the United States, but just in terms of the coming of age transition story. I think this is a very good text as a literature course, as an English course aimed at the high school students. I really like that. What else did I like? I thought that, as I said before, the fact that Lina is an unreliable protagonist in some respects, and that it is truly written from her perspective, is extremely useful. And her limited knowledge is actually quite instructive for the audience, because many people in the audience won't know this content. The fact that Lina herself is struggling to learn is quite strong. And just the quality of the language is really evocative. You get that incredible grotesqueness of the situation without it going to the absolute extremes. Like, you don't see them, cannibalizing each other or anything like that. There were things that happen in real life that you wouldn't put in this book, but they were clearly, you get that desperation, and even when you think that things can't get any worse, then they do. And it's done in an entirely believable way where you are really legitimately on that journey with the main characters. And the relationship between the characters is quite compelling as well. They're always true to themselves. I don't feel like I was just reading the author from different perspectives. I really thought that I was reading different characters.
Yeah. So
very, very strong, and an important undercovered, under-researched part of world history, which is a difficult subject matter to cover. And also I know that the author did interview a range of survivors, people who were involved, their experiences in preparation for this book, and very difficult to do this justice. And yet I think she did that in spades. So mandatory text, really good book. If you've got children, teenagers, probably, I wouldn't go for young teenagers, so 16 and above. I think it would be a great book for them, just to encourage them to read if you're getting them interested in reading. It doesn't matter if they don't know anything about this history and so on. That's not required. Yeah, a really great book.
I do agree on the descriptors, actually. There was enough of there to be like, then this happened. It was such a short sentence, but you're thinking like, what? Like, they didn't have to go into that detail. It was just... Yeah, no, I agree. It was just, they gave enough detail to describe the situation for you to have an emotive response. I don't want to spoil it every time I talk.
No, it's understandable, because there are books that you don't care about spoiling too much because you don't really care if the audience reads it. This is a book that I think we both want you to read if you haven't read it.
For sure.
So, criticisms.
Okay. This is the biggest criticism I have of the book, and maybe because it's my lack of knowledge, but it was more like, why? So what is the point? If you're going to take over their houses, and you're going to take over their whole living, why bother shipping all these people, selling, whatever, doing all that stuff instead of just shooting them? Why?
So you're asking, why the NKVD, if they're going to just take all their property and possess their stuff and get rid of them, send them thousands of kilometers to
Siberia? Why put all that effort in? There's just so many logistics in place that you have to do, and then they have to do farming beets and all these other stuff, and it's like, what's the point?
They're clearly not farmers, are they?
No, and they have to create these barracks. Cool, but you'd get I mean, you wouldn't need all of them. You get the
Mm.
strongest of the strong, and then you would leave the rest. Like it didn't make sense in my mind. The clear motivations behind it all. But perhaps because I didn't read into it more, or there were.
No, I think that is a very important research question. Why send people who have no knowledge or experience of what you're trying to do, who you see are criminals, enemies of the state? Do you keep them alive, feed them, house them, ship them all the way across to the end of the world just to work them to death? It's a very... Now, I'm sure part of the answer is the insanity of the Soviet system. Like, if you think of bureaucracy in your normal day-to-day life, government decisions that are made that make no sense, the down-the-line impacts that are just totally illogical because the book says, there's a lot of that goes on in the Soviet Union, right? There's a lot of, oh, we did that because that's what the rule says, right? Rather than what is the reason behind the rule, what is the ultimate goal. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of the bureaucratic inertia. And we see that with sudden changes in policy, just how dramatic the situation can change for people. But in terms of the ultimate motivation, I don't think that's adequately explained in the book.
No,
or even tackled.
Like that scene of where they're like waiting for a pregnant woman to give birth and to take her because she's part of, the list. She's not capable of building a barrack or whatever they need, And there was a stark scene of like where they were digging up a hole. I don't know what the hole was for, but they just kicked them in the hole and then like ruined the hole. Like there's just certain things like maybe it's because they're looking at them as less than human and they want to see suffering. But it was just the practicality in my side. I was like, but what's the objective here?
Yeah, and so, no, you make a good point. And in fact, the book, one of my criticisms is that the book answers questions that the readers don't ask and doesn't answer the questions that they do ask. So there's a whole mystery around why it was that Lina and Jonas and the parents were taken away. I think it would have been perfectly fine to let the reader assume, and I, as a reader, didn't even bother asking. I was like, well, they're Lithuanians in an occupied territory ahead of a German advance who are possible enemies of the state. End of story. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a complete, obviously.
An intelligent upper class, in
a Marxist Soviet system. I mean, what more explanation was required? And yet, there is this big song and dance about and they go into in the diaries and the memories and the reveals of the other characters as if this is a big part. Nobody cares about this, right? It's clear that this happened, but why this specific thing was happening to these people in this way, I think was a much bigger question, which the author didn't try to tackle. It was more, what are the political situation for these characters? I thought that was it's not a huge thing. It is a nitpick, but it was a misdirection of what the reader, I think, would have gotten the most benefit from.
But then, like you said, it's probably under-researched. They're probably still understanding why it happened.
Sure.
Especially when you're interviewing people who've gone through so much trauma. Like, they probably don't know.
Yes, but you could have an answer in the book that reflects that. So let's say the characters themselves try and find out from the NKVD. And if the NKVD says, we have no idea, this is just what the book says, or because we just want to see your stuff. Whatever the answer is, or shrug, right? Like, if the answer is there is no reason, then that's an answer. But the question didn't have an answer, and so I think that was just left hanging. But it's something that I think you have to. You only worry about if you think about it on the book on a deep level, and overall. Having some mysteries is perfectly fine. It's just the fact that they went out of their way to
explain
answer
everything else.
Was just like, it's not really the main game here. Another thing that kind of just on that political context, which I think they tackle, and perhaps it's a product of the debate, is they have an argument about whether it's a great thing that the Germans had invaded the Soviet Union and were liberating Lithuania. And you had different characters arguing about this. Now, I won't give this away because it is important for one of the characters. Kind of other people saying, oh no, the Germans are going to be as bad as the Soviets are. They're just going to occupy us like the Soviets have, and so on. So that political debate in the background I thought was kind of interesting, but also a bit on the negative side, because I think that at that stage, the overwhelming majority of Lithuanians in those early days would have been like, yes, we're being liberated. I think the whole reality of being squeezed between occupying great powers and so forth and torn apart would have only...
was not on their mind.
At that time. Because at that moment, these people are being taken away by the NKVD. The vast majority of people are going to be like, let's see if we can escape to the Germans, right? Like the fact that wasn't an obvious motivation for the characters involved struck me as a bit discombobulating, because I'm like, look, if I'm in the back, there's an invading army who I think is going to liberate me. I'm getting to those people, right? And so I think it's because we've got the weight of decades going, oh, look what the Germans were. It's not really, it's taking them out of that time and place. Now, either I think they should have not touched on it at all and just left it as a thing that was happening in the background, which wasn't relevant, or make it a key motivator for the different characters.
So what you're saying is you feel like they misrepresented what the attitudes of that time would have been.
Oh, no, I think the author did her best. I just think that this is more of a nitpick in the sense that there would have been some confusion and debate about what the invasion by Germany means. But I think at that early stage, probably not. Particularly if you're being dragged away by the NKVD to the Soviet Union. You're kind of going to be very happy that the Germans are invading. You want the Germans to move faster, you know? And so I think there's... I think just... You don't need to insult the Lithuanians by saying this, because at this early stage, it seems obvious. Like, I would be celebrating, right? If I was occupied by the Soviet Union and the Germans had invaded and nothing bad had happened yet, except that the Germans were getting rid of my occupiers, I would have been like, yay, Germany, right? So I don't see how this is a negative. I think it was, touched on in a brave way. But I just, probably a bit negative. My main criticism of the book, there's two main criticisms, other than the Kretzsky thing, which I actually really dislike. Two main criticisms. One, as I said at the start, went out of my way not to know anything about the author, any of the background, but it was obvious to me at the end of the first act that it was an American author, because she gives herself away. And this is not a problem for the author herself. I think the editors should have picked this up. All right,
How did you know?
Yeah, so
she's
for
got
example,
colour with the no without the U.
No. I'm deeply critical of the editors and the publishers for not picking this up.
Okay.
So for example, there's a couple of examples, but an obvious one was Lina's talking about food, and she's like, "Oh, it reminds me of turkey." I'm like, "You mean a native North American bird in Lithuania in 1940s?" That Lina, who's probably never heard of a turkey, let alone eaten a turkey, and if she did have a turkey, why would she be reminded of it because it's dry and horrible? Why would Lina want a turkey, right? And so it was things like that. I was like, this is an American author. And so I didn't know she was an American author until reading the book, but from the book I could tell she was American. I think those kinds of things are pretty straightforward to pick up, and that could easily be dealt with in the editing process. So it could be chicken, it could have been pork, whatever. Move on. The fact that it was a Native American bird, I was like, oh. And so there are a couple of examples like that where if you're doing a period piece, it's very important to get those kinds of things right to a reasonable degree. You can't get everything right. You know, perhaps an amber comes from a particular beach. It's actually from another beach. That's fine. But if you're talking about continental cultural icons, you've got to be able to account for those. And I think the author could easily, just in the typing flow, not notice. the editors and publishers have to notice these things. It's just inexcusable.
Put chicken.
Yeah. The other thing that I didn't like, and this was in the writing of the book, was that in the third act, they introduced too many new characters. So there are different locations in the book. The main characters, they go to this other location and they introduce another little girl who talks to a decapitated doll. Yeah. They introduce the guy that's repeating himself. They introduce all these new characters who you don't care about, who you have no backstory with. And what happens to them doesn't matter because they're just like NPCs, right? And for the first two acts, you're with the same people and you're going on this journey together. And then some of those same people are in the third act, and then a whole bunch of new people are in that third act. And I'm like, this is not the right time of the book to be introducing these people. You either introduce them way at the beginning, or you don't worry about it. You just you don't give them any characteristics or any lines at all, right? They can be there, just in the background. People that Lina observes, but not as people who actually speak and interact. That kind of just distracted from, okay, why are these people here? What's their story? Why do I care about them? Oh, actually, I shouldn't care about them. Okay, I get it. Yeah. So that kind of the third act was weaker than the other two for that reason. So it finished like a little bit. It sort of petered suddenly. It petered out. Yeah, I think it ended in a spot where, and the whole it was almost to a sex machina in the sense that. There's a resolution. Obviously, I won't tell you what happens, but there's no way of knowing ahead of time that resolution is coming, and that's unfortunate. But no, all of these places that they talk about do exist, and I looked up the geography of it, and if you go up the Lina River, which is frozen the vast majority of the year, it's a 4,500 kilometer river that goes up to the North Pole. It's an amazing, desolate, remote part of the world, and being sent out there would have been just extraordinary. And many people were, many people from Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. So the story is all true. So that's that. In that sense, I can understand. Also, I think for the third act, it would have been very hard for the author herself to go and see these places and do it firsthand. Like you can go to Vilnius and Kaunas and Western Russia and talk about these sorts of and you can go visit collective farms and things like that and sort of get a sense of what was actually happening and write about that with authority. Whereas I think those kind of settlements in the far north of Siberia would have been hard to kind of get your head around unless you were there. Very, very hard to get to. So forgivable that perhaps it wasn't as strong in that respect. But no, I mean, the book overall, I mean, when I say the third act wasn't strongest, it was only relative. Like the other bits were so strong, the third one was fine. It was just, if you compare it to the rest of the book. Yeah.
Did you like the conclusion?
Well, I don't want to give away spoilers. I think no. I would have been a bit braver with my ending
and be more realist.
Not necessarily. I don't mind. I won't tell you what the ending was, but I don't mind that kind of ending. But I would have been braver with the actual resolution. I think I would have had the main characters end up with different people, and I would have how they got there would have been different. I would have had them a bit more compromised and damaged than perhaps they were. So I would have had a different ending. But it's a matter of taste. I actually don't think the ending. I couldn't say the ending was a negative. I just think it was a bit lazy. Not lazy, bit easy.
Yeah, it could be easy. It's always nice. You would like a grittier ending. I don't know. I just kind of yes, to America. We fight for freedom. Not aliens can stop us. I don't know. But, so I kind of found the ending. Yeah, I didn't mind the ending, and then the ending was a true story, so that's cool too. All right. So, was there anything else?
No, I think we're good.
I think we are good. Yeah.
Thanks for being with us on this journey, and thank you very much for the recommendations. We will watch the video, the movie that this is based on, at some point as well, and perhaps do a briefer compare and contrast. We've recorded a lot of video for this review, so we will be cutting it down, but it might still be a bit long. I apologize if the review does drag, but it's a well and truly worthy book.
And it was a great book, and I think it opened my eyes to it, because I only read about it from like Wikipedia, what happened, and then through doing the history videos, but to actually have real life stories really put in perspective of history. Just gave me some things to think about. Rating, before we finish off, rating this book.
Okay, depends on the target audience. Okay. So for ordinary general audiences, I give it an 8 out of 10. I think it's a really good book. The negatives are mostly nitpicks, and I can't think of anyone that I know that if they read it, they would regret having done so. Also, it's a real page turn. It doesn't take you that long. It's very easy to read. So 8 out of 10. If the target audience is classroom, high school, English classes, social economics classes, I would give this a 9.5 out of 10. I think this is a really solid text for kids to read and to get their heads around. In fact, one thing we didn't discuss is there are discussion questions in the back of my version. There is a couple, we won't go into them now, but for example, comparing it with The Diary of Anne Frank, I think the comparisons between these two books are striking. And if you're structuring a kind of curriculum where you could get them to read one and then the other as like the two books of the semester and then have them discuss and contrast, I think this is a really great book. And I think it's of that quality which adds value, not to mention the real importance of sharing stories about this under-researched bit of world history where thousands, 100,000 plus people were deported by the NKVD to Siberia under the most horrendous conditions, the vast majority of them dying in the worst possible circumstances. And the whole system that allowed for that to happen should be discussed. And I think this is a great catalyst for that purpose. So 9.5 if it's that audience, and for a general reading audience interested in fiction, 8 out of 10. Yeah.
I think that's pretty on par. I think, well, for me, I think it was like 8.5, 9, because it is quite a page turner. Like, I take forever to read books, but this one took like a week because I was like every day on the trail, like, oh, I gotta read that book again. And the pace was really good. The characters' development's really good. Like everything. There's just, I think for just a general audience, I think there's something in this book for everyone to enjoy. I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Between Shades of Grey, Ruta Sepetys, get into it. If you have any suggestions, as I said, please leave them down below. And if you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so very much, and
ciao for now.